All right, welcome everyone to the Hawk meeting. One thing for certain, COVID has given us an opportunity to learn how to have quality programs during a time of pandemic. And it's also, even though we had Dr. Tallamy, our guest speaker tonight, booked to make an in-person appearance, it's allowed him to reach a lot more people without having to leave home. So we're excited about everybody joining us. And because we're not live and in person, I think we're reaching a lot of people that may not normally come to a Hawk meeting. We are the Southeast Charlotte and Matthews chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. So you may not have been familiar with us if you didn't kind of live in our territory. So if you don't live in our territory, we are delighted that you are joining us this evening to hear this important message. And as I said, Habitat and Wildlife Keepers is a chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, and we are based in Matthews. We're 15 years old. We're starting our 15th year. And what's really great about Dr. Tallamy is that when we were doing our 10-year anniversary celebration program, he kicked it off that year for us. And this year he's helping us celebrate our 15th year. So just a little bit about what we do. When we founded Hawk, we wanted to create a network of like-minded individuals to share resources and local conservation news. We wanted to raise awareness for the need, importance, and ease of acting locally to impact the environment globally. We wanted to create a local presence and a unified voice for representation on conservation issues, and also offer educational opportunities to learn how to become effective stewards of the environment. And of course, we wanted to practice stewardship by performing local conservation projects. So we've, as I said, we're starting our 15th year, and it's we've had to get creative, but we're also getting some great speakers to join us this year. And then if you missed our September presentation, that was David Misajewski, who is the national spokesperson for the National Wildlife Federation. And if you missed it, you can go to our website, and there is a recording of that presentation that you can listen to. And if you did get it and you were there and you want to listen to it again, his presentation was about unintended consequences. Sometimes when you start feeding the birds and other critters in your yard, you may get something you had not counted on. There's also lots of people who love birds but hate snakes. They love snakes, they don't like spiders. And he tried to go through and give us kind of the pros for all of the native wildlife that we have. And then of course in October we've got Dr. Tallamy. December we've got Kim O'Shea, and she's going to be talking to us about citizen science projects that are very popular right now because the kids are out of school, we can't go anywhere, no parties, and we're all getting outside more. There's a lot of citizen science projects that you can participate in. And then in January, we have Kim Delosier, who's going to be talking to us about bears. Kim worked with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission for years. And he has got tons of fascinating stories about the black bears. And of course, as black bears, their populations are increasing, and there have been more sightings and more encounters. And then how do we coexist with them? So that's going to be our January presentation. So to keep up with all of the events that we have going on, and we will be adding to this as time goes on, you can follow us on our website, which is hawkncwf.org. Also go to our Facebook page, and we've got all of our events on the Facebook page. So and I'm going to just start turning it over to Dr. Tallamy here in a minute, but I wanted to introduce him. His first book, Bringing Nature Home, and I usually, when I've got mine, this is not my copy, mine's a hard copy, and I started highlighting it and putting flags on what I considered the important parts until I realized I was highlighting and flagging pretty much every page. His first book was one of my favorite books of all time, and it had a real impact on me because it helped me understand the importance of native plants and our native wildlife. And so he's been a hero of mine. The last time I introduced him, I think I called you my Justin Bieber. Now I think I'll somebody with a little more gravitas, maybe my Dr. Fauci. You're my Dr. Fauci.
Okay.
and now his second book is Nature's Best Hope, which when Daniel told me it was better than the first one, I'm like, no way, and he's right. So we couldn't wait to have Dr. Tallamy come and talk to us about this. He is a professor of entomology at the University of Delaware, and as I said, one of my heroes. After he's going to go through his presentation, you've got a chat feature on the Zoom, and we're going to be taking questions at the end of his presentation. But if you'll go into the chat feature, put your question in there, and then Daniel and I are going to consolidate those, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of similar questions. We'll consolidate them, and we'll moderate the question and answer at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, Dr. Tallamy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Carol. Okay, I think we're up and ready. Dr. Fauci, I don't know what to say about that, but thanks for coming tonight, everybody. I want to talk to you about what I consider to be nature's best hope. But before I do that, I want to revisit what happened at least in the Northeast last year, and I think it happened in North Carolina as well. All the red oaks got together and decided they would make their acorns at the same time. We call that an oak mast, and this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, if you were easily entertained like I am, maybe you took one of those acorns and just stared at it. And if you stared long enough, you might have seen this, an insect starting to chew its way out of that acorn. And it chews and it pushes and it squeezes and kind of looks like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally plops down onto the ground. Very dangerous time for this insect because it tastes good. It is a great thing to eat, and a lot of things want to eat it. So it's got to protect itself by getting below the ground. And a few more squirms and squiggles, and about 30 seconds down it goes, where it stretches in all different directions and forms a little chamber. And then it converts itself to a pupa, and it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years it comes out, it's an acorn weevil. Now, a lot of people think acorn weevils or any kind of weevil has a big nose, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here. Females take those mouth parts and chew a hole right down into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg here, and that's how the larva gets down into the acorn. Well, you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the next year like most insects? And the reason is that it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. If they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be very many acorns for them. Well, of course, after the acorn weevil leaves the acorn, it leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know, nature abhors a vacuum, but there are ants that fill that vacuum. Three species of temnothorax ants love to live inside of the vacated holes made by acorn weevils. And if they discover a new one, they get excited because they want to move the entire colony into that nest, or that they want to make it a nest. So they work hard, they carry larvae, everybody gets involved. It only takes about 30 minutes for them to move the colony, all their eggs in there. Then they post a guard right here. There's his antennae to make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they're going to live for the next 2 years. Well, about this time, my wife says, "What's your point? What are you trying to tell us?" My point is, that is what nature is built from. Millions of these types of specialized interactions. Here's another one right here. Between jays and oaks, jays are the primary dispersers of acorns. They can fly up to 2 miles away from the parent tree. Put that acorn in the ground. That's how a lot of acorns get planted. If you want to have pileated woodpeckers breeding in your yard, for example, it's not going to happen unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that's what they rear their young on. And you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilia, unless you have Facilia, which is this plant here. That's the only pollen that bee can rear its young on, highly specialized. As a matter of fact, out of the 4,000 species of native bees we have, about a third of them are host plant specialists. They can only rear their young on pollen of particular plant genera. There are about 13 species of bees, at least in the East here, that can only rear their young on the pollen of perennial sunflowers, for example. Here's Baltimore checker spot. You're not going to have it unless you have white turtlehead. So this is what nature is. It's a series of these specialized relationships. But today, these types of relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice seriously. Way back in 1908, Teddy got wind of the fact that the state of Arizona was planning to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, he looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process that created the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, is that today it's impossible to leave most of the country as it was. Because there's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that, of course, is because we've used the country heavily. We've logged it a number of times. We've tilled it. We've drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland. Of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We've polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in natural areas, as kudzu is doing here. In short, we have carved up the natural world into tiny fragments of its former self, and each one of those fragments is too small and too isolated from other fragments to sustain the species that we need to run the ecosystems that support us. Now, we've done this because, for so many centuries, we thought our nest, planet Earth, was so big we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong. There are serious consequences. Now, this is one of them. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? We're talking about the global insect decline, followed by this headline: North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population. As a matter of fact, the UN is now predicting that we will lose a million species to extinction, possibly in the next 20 years. And they report this as if it's just another headline. That's like saying we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years. This is not an option, folks. It's simply not an option. We have to make sure these things don't happen. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that would require small efforts from a lot of people, but those small efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, Edward O. Wilson, E.O. Wilson from Harvard, told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects. And he did it way back in 1987. In this paper, he called The Little Things That Run the World. He's talking about the importance of conserving invertebrates, and he's largely talking about insects. And his message was clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants, which would not only change the physical structure of terrestrial Earth, but it would pretty much end energy flow through our terrestrial habitats, which would cause the collapse of the food webs that support our animals. The amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, they would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would lose the insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that does not have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, just as a reminder, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on highly functioning ecosystems that produce what we call ecosystem services. This is what plants give us, just a few things that plants give us, like oxygen, cleaning our water before it gets to the sea where it's too salty to use. Here's an enormously important one these days: carbon capture. Plants, of course, are built out of carbon. They pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's good. Then they put it in their tissues, but they do that, they fix a lot more carbon than they can use. So they pump the extra carbon into the ground. The soil is brown or black because of carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the ages. Plants build topsoil, they hold it in place. If we didn't have plants, all the topsoil would be in the ocean. It would wash away and it would just be a rocky mass. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and many other things. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of these types of services is simply not an option. Certainly not an option today. It never was a good option, but today we've got 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet, which actually is way more than the planet can sustain. So we've got to help it out by getting as many ecosystem services out of every inch of the earth as we can. Well, there were visionaries through the ages who recognized that we humans had an unsustainable relationship with the land that supports us. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent in the early 1900s. He wrote lots of things. And one of the things he said was, the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been some indigenous groups that have been really pretty good at that, but our Western culture, our extractive capitalistic culture is terrible at it. We're real good at spoiling places, but then we simply move to another place and spoil it. And that is unsustainable. So Aldo suggested, his dream was that we develop a land ethic, and he wrote about this in Sand County Almanac. He recognized we needed to use the earth. We needed to farm it and lumber it and graze on it and mine and hunt and do all those things, but we needed to learn how to do that without destroying local ecosystems. And if we did, that would be the land ethic that he dreamt about. What he never talked about or wrote about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I'll bet it was because the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in Aldo's culture, and is still embedded in our own, that he didn't even recognize it as an option. But I'm going to argue tonight that living with nature not only is an option, I'm going to argue that it is the only viable option that is left to us. You know, in the past, conservationists worked almost exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We have to turn that on its head now. Now we have to save natural systems where there are a lot of people, because that's most of the earth. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. So where should we start? Well, private property is a good place to start because so much of the land is privately owned. We certainly can't ignore it. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we didn't do conservation on private property, we'd be dealing with 15% of the land, and that's what creates those little isolated habitat fragments, not nearly enough. But there are also lots of areas that we never think of as potential places for conservation. How about power and pipeline rights of ways or railroad rights of ways? That's 24 million acres right there. Or the sides of roadsides. We got 4 million miles of roads, paved roads, and all of those roads have two sides to them. That's 17 more million acres. Golf course is 2 million acres, airport's 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are large areas. Then all the places we live, both in rural areas and suburbia, our urban centers, hundreds of millions of acres. And you can think of other places where we could do conservation. If you just add up these, that's 599 million acres. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, plus California, plus Texas. Not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We have lots of places to do conservation. Well, when I say conservation, I don't really mean that. We can't conserve what's in these places because it's already gone. What we have to do is rebuild it. We have to restore nature. And if I say restoration ecology, I get criticized for that because people say, oh, you can't put it back exactly the way it was. That's true. We can't. But we can reestablish natural interactions, those specialized interactions that I talked about at the beginning, and recreate an ecosystem that is functioning in a way that will help keep us alive on this planet. That's the goal. But all species don't contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the species that contribute the most, the ones that other species depend on. And one of the first things we have to do is reconstruct food webs. Remember, plants are capturing the energy from the sun, turning it into food. And if they don't pass it on to animals, it's locked up in the plant. Well, most animals don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that something is typically insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. It turns out that we have known since 1988 that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So what would happen to our ecosystems if caterpillars were to disappear? Most of the energy would remain locked up in plants. Let's look at Carolina chickadees for an example. They, of course, they're at our feeders right now, eating seed, and everybody thinks that's all they need is seed. And during the winter, that's not even true. 50% of their diet in the winter is insects, but they are primarily seed eaters most of the time. When they're reproducing, though, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch to insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars if they live in an area rich enough to make those caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do we know that? Well, here's a bit of data that might convince you. It comes from a recent PhD student of mine, Ashley Kennedy, who did a citizen science project where she asked people from all over the country to take pictures of birds as they were carrying food to the nest. And people did. They loved this. They sent her about 7,000 pictures, and she identified the prey items in the beak of the bird. The green bars in each one of these 20 bird families represent the percentage of the nestling diet that was caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families in North America, caterpillars are dominating the nestling diet. So again, what would happen if we lost our caterpillars? 16 out of 20 common bird families would not be able to reproduce. I mean, that's unthinkable. So what's about why caterpillars? Why are they so special to birds? There are actually a number of reasons. One is they're soft. If you think of this caterpillar as a sausage with a very thin wrapper, the thin wrapper is cuticle. It's exoskeleton. It's not digestible. So birds don't want a lot of that. And then it wraps around a lot of protein and fat, a wonderful, wonderful meal. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. If you've ever watched a parent bird feed its young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds, the warblers right now, as they pass through our yard, are picking off aphids. But do you want to chase 200 aphids or eat one caterpillar? Caterpillars are also really nutritious, as I said, high in fat, high in protein, very low percentage of chitin compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks, and they've got a lot of sharp edges. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates. And vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. They have to get them from plants. And they have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of our diets. And that's why my wife Cindy says I have to eat my beta carotene to get my carrots. No, I have to eat my carrots to get my beta carotene. That's how that works. I have to eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene. I have to eat whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I have a good diet like that, getting all those carotenoids because they stimulate my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a strong immune system. They're also antioxidants. They run around our body and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking primarily about these male birds, like a male prothonotary warbler. He is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. And he makes pigments out of those luteins, puts them in his feathers, and the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. So birds are getting their carotenoids from the prey items that they're eating. But carotenoids are not equally distributed among invertebrate prey items. The first two bars here represent two types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other prey items. The third most, best food source for carotenoids is orthopteroids, things like crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. These are just left over from when they were caterpillars. And here's the earthworm way down here. The early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get a lot of carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does this influence prey choice when birds are foraging? Well, Ashley did another study with bluebirds. She put GoPro cameras on the roofs of bluebird houses, and those cameras took a picture once every second. And she had a lot of cameras and a lot of bluebird boxes, and she did this for 3 years. So she ended up with more than 1 million pictures she had to go through. But the idea was to catch the bluebird as it flew into the box. They often landed on the roof of the box and posed, and the camera would take their picture. And then she could identify what was in the bird's beak. And what she found is that the prey items brought in most frequently were caterpillars, and of course they had the highest level of carotenoids. Then the second most common prey item were crickets and other orthopteroids, and they had the second highest. And then everybody else was nestled way down here. So all this suggests that caterpillars are important to birds. In fact, they may not be optional parts of the diet. It's starting to look like they are essential parts of bird diets. So we know that birds need caterpillars. Now the question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? Again, let's go to chickadees. A lot of data on chickadees. No, 1 or 2 is not enough. They need thousands, many thousands. Chickadees require 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, just to get their nestlings to the point where they can leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 24 days. Where are they getting all these caterpillars? Thousands of caterpillars. Well, if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, they have to get them from your yard. Chickadees and most birds do not forage very far from the nest. It takes too much energy. So chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. So if you want to have breeding chickadees, you got to have thousands of caterpillars in your yard within 50 meters of the nest. And when we don't landscape in a way that creates all these caterpillars or all these insects that the birds need, it's starting to look like that's one of the major factors in bird declines. You know, the headline that said we'd lost 3 billion birds, that was from Rosenberg et al. Last year. They posted their data online, and we could look and see which birds were actually declining, because all birds weren't declining equally. And we divided them into 2 groups, the birds for which insects are essential, they're absolutely necessary, particularly when they're breeding, and birds that really don't need insects for food. This includes the finches and the doves that can reproduce on seeds. Well, they actually increased in population a little bit in the last 50 years. But the birds that require insects lost on average about 10 million individuals per species, suggesting there is a really tight correlation between needing insects and whether or not you're going to be increasing or not. As we design landscapes that eliminate insects, we're designing landscapes that eliminate birds. So I'm concluding from that we need a landscape for caterpillars so that we can have birds and many other things. So how do we do that? Well, it's not hard. You add caterpillars to your landscape by adding the plants that make those caterpillars. There is a catch though, and that is all plants don't make caterpillars equally. So you have to add the right plants. If you look at this, here's data for the Southwest. I've got to change this slide, but all these slides look exactly the same. The number of plant genera along the x-axis here, there are 1,531 native plant genera in the Southwest. And if you're looking at the number of caterpillar species that each one supports, many of them support none. A lot of them support 1 or 2. There's only a few plant genera that support a lot of caterpillars. So these are the workhorses. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but you gotta be planting these if you want to support those food webs. Why can't caterpillars eat any plant? Why don't they eat any plant? They don't eat any plant because over the eons, they have to specialize on particular plant lineages. So for example, if you want monarchs in your yard, planting a crepe myrtle, putting in a camellia or anything else is not going to do it. You've got to have milkweeds. That is the only plant genus they have specialized on. Why are so many of our insect herbivores specialists? Plants have made them that way. Plants don't want insects to eat them, so they try to protect their tissues, making typically chemical defenses, make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. Sometimes there's physical defenses as well. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of those plants. They're too well protected. And if you don't believe me, after this talk, go out and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not gonna like it. Every non-agricultural plant is well defended with nasty chemicals. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. Yes, that's a joke. Well, we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses that are everywhere? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only get around the defenses of one or two plant lineages. Each plant lineage uses different defenses, and insects can't overcome all of that. So they specialize on one or two types of defenses. They develop the adaptations that allow them to eat those plants without dying. The enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of exposure to those lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to restore the life in particular landscapes, we have to choose the plants that are going to allow us to do that. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how that actually works. I'm going to start with our house. This is what our house looked like, our yard looked like when we moved in. We live in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We have 10 acres of a farm that was broken up. I'm actually sitting in that window right now. This farm was worked to death. I mean, it's been in agriculture since the late 1600s, 300 years. Most of the topsoil is down in a valley over here. The last bit of farming they did before we moved in was to mow the area for hay. But it was so invaded with Asian plants, invasive species, that what they were really mowing was autumn olive and multiflora rose and calling that hay. So when we moved in, of course, they had stopped mowing, and this is what it looked like: Oriental bittersweet, and Japanese honeysuckle, and bush honeysuckle, and again, multiflora rose, autumn olive. That's my wife Cindy getting ready to get rid of all this stuff from 10 acres, and she did. If you have a bad invasive species problem, it can be discouraging, but you pick at it a little bit here, a little bit there, and you can do it. What was I doing while she was working to get rid of this stuff? Well, I was telling her she was doing an excellent job, but I also was putting plants back that should have been there, that probably used to be there, but I was picking and choosing. I was starting with plants that would attract caterpillars that I wanted to take pictures of, because that's what I like to do. And I started with the Canadian owlet, and that's what its adult looks like. Looks like a leaf. You can't have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow-rue. That is the only plant that they will eat. And of course, we had no meadow-rue. And there's no meadow-rue around us. I don't know where the nearest meadow-rue is. So I got some seeds from somebody and planted meadow-rue. And I thought it would take years, if ever, for that moth to find the meadow-rue. So I planted it, but I didn't check it. Germinated, and I didn't go out and check it. It was a month and a half, 2 months, and I finally went out and looked. It was almost defoliated by Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. A speedy success, and I was impressed. And now I've got a good population of meadow-rue and Canadian owlets. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. This is a misnomer. They have nothing to do with goldenrod. They are specialists on this plant, Biden's aristosa. Some people call it ditch daisy. Grows readily from seed. It does well in wet areas as well. Well, I did know where there's some Biden's aristosa was. It was in a power line cut about 15 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them. It took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find it, but this is a great plant. We've got it all over the place now, and goldenrod stowaway is another great success. So now I've added 4 species to my yard: 2 plants and 2 moths. Wanted hackberry emperor because it's a butterfly that should be on our property, but we didn't have any hackberry. It had been long gone. That's what the adult looks like. So we planted hackberry, and this took 3 or 4 years for them to find it, but they did. I checked one of my hackberries as I was walking past it this June, and there were 9 hackberry emperors on 1 branch. So another great success. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came the things that eat goldenrod. Goldenrod's a really productive plant, supports 110 species of caterpillars in our area. So things like the brown hooded owlet, the Arsidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, goldenrod gall moth. This is one I'm waiting for. All those other guys came, but this one has not come yet. This is the goldenrod flower moth, and that's what its larvae look like. So this is anticipation. This is like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out right at this time and I look all over for the goldenrod stowaway. I mean, for the goldenrod flower moth. Haven't found it yet, but one of these years I will, and that will be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper for the same reason. I wanted to attract particular caterpillars, particularly this one, Pandora sphinx, because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else, and so is its adult. But in planting such a powerful plant, I got lots of other things that I wasn't looking for, like the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, and many others. Wanted the zebra swallowtail. Well, this is a specialist on pawpaw. We didn't have any pawpaw, so we planted pawpaw. Now this one, this took a lot longer. The nearest population to us that I know about that has zebra swallowtail is 26 miles away. We waited 9 years. And in the meantime, while we were waiting before it came, and it did come, we got the pawpaw sphinx. I didn't even know there was a pawpaw sphinx. And of course, we got lots of pawpaws. One of the double tooth prominence, so I could take this picture. It's looks like a dinosaur, but it's an elm specialist. So we planted American elm. It came pretty quickly. One of the evening primrose moth, because it's beautiful and it hides in evening primrose during the day. Cute little thing. And we planted lots of oaks. Now these are just examples of what we planted, but planted oaks because I knew they were powerful plants. Now, a lot of people think you need a giant oak before it can start to contribute to your yard. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, and people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. You don't need a giant oak. They say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Well, you can enjoy it on day one, well, maybe day two. Because I planted my oaks as acorns or 2-foot bare root whips. Which meant they were free or cost $1 or so. So we all can afford it. And right away, they start attracting the things that use oaks, like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenal's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered caterpillar, the orange-headed epicalina, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to my oaks. And they come right away. Here's a picture of a pin oak. First year, popped up above the leaf litter here. And here's a crocus geometer standing on the ground eating the leaves of this little pin oak. So you don't have to wait hundreds of years for them to contribute to your ecosystem. They will do it immediately. This is a picture of our house from the same place I took that first picture. We got a little lawn here, so we're very traditional, but this is just to convince you, we put the plants back. And of course, right away, I noticed that so many moth species have come to our yard. Butterflies have come too, but I haven't started working on them. Just the moth species that I made it a goal to take a picture of every single species of moth that I could find. If I don't get a picture, I don't count it. And I'm up to 1,012 species of moths that have come to our yard. That's 1,012 species of bird food that have come to our yard. Now remember, our yard is 10 acres. That is what, 39% of all the moth species in all of Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the area, I'm getting almost 40% of the moth species because we've got the productive plants here. And because we're making all that bird food, we've had 59 species of birds breed on our 10 acres. That's success. Last week, did you see this headline? World Wildlife Fund says 2/3 of wildlife have vanished since 1970. All I can say is not at our house. Not at our house. I'm sure we've increased the number of species at our house by way more than 2/3. I just want to convince you that these wildlife losses are reversible. Not all of them, but a lot of them are reversible. We can't give up. But I know what you're thinking. Well, you own 10 acres and I just live in suburbia. Will it work on a smaller property? That's a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They own 0.6 acres, just a little bit over half an acre, in a typical suburban neighborhood. They are surrounded by people with big lawns and not very many plants. But what they did in their property was to get rid of their invasive species, which the primary one was bush honeysuckle. They planted native plants, and they also put in a water feature called a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that have used their yard. And they are up to 149 bird species, 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. This is almost all the warblers in the country have gone to the terpster's half acre. What about urban yards? Will it work in urban yards? Another good question. Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. She lives right next to one of the runways of O'Hare Airport, right next to Kennedy Expressway. She only has 1/10 of an acre. That is 3 times smaller than the average lot size for US homes. Same thing, she got rid of her invasive species, planted 60 species of native plants, and put in a water feature. There's no connectivity with any natural area in her yard. So she is definitely an island. But because she made those changes, she has counted 116 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. This guy right there, she took that picture as he sat next to her. Well, I don't know where he was. He was in her yard someplace. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house in Chicago and check it out. But what about any inner city centers? 82% of the country now lives in cities. Another good question. 2014, I was looking at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, but that reminds me we have a serious marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and then wonder why people don't plant them. So we're not going to call this butterfly weed anymore. We're going to call it Monarch's Delight. I was looking at Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I saw was this megachilid bee, this leafcutter bee. I know it's a leafcutter bee because it collects its pollen on its tummy, not on its legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very specific requirements. Not only do they need pollen and nectar, they also need soft, pliable leaves, like the leaves of redbud, because they carve the edges out of those leaves, roll them up, stuff them full of pollen. That's where they lay an egg on that, and that's where they rear their young. And then they put that roll into a crack or a crevice. Well, right next to Monarch's Delight, there was a redbud. So they had exactly what they needed. And because there was a redbud there, which bloomed early in the spring, there was lots of forage for queen bumblebees. Queen bumblebees in the spring don't have any workers. They've got to do all the work themselves while they get their colony going. So they need a lot of early spring blooms. And there were bumblebees there, so obviously they had what they needed. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw 2 monarchs. And that was good news. This was 2014. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. Remember, 2013 was the low point of the monarch population, only 3.6% of them left. And this was also June, which is early for us to see monarchs up this far north. So I was very happy. It was a good sign. And the monarchs were there, of course, because they had Monarch's Delight. They also had other species of milkweeds, everything they needed for forage and also to reproduce. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, and that's the High Line. It's an elevated, if you haven't been there, it's an elevated railroad that somebody realized would make a good tourist destination. So they planted mostly, not entirely, but mostly native plants in a little strip along this railroad. And now literally millions of visitors go to the High Line every single year. This is Rick Dark. He convinced me to go to the High Line. He wanted me to go the whole time. I'm not much of a city boy. And I figured, well, I'll see a lot of pretty plants, but I won't see anything on those plants because it's the middle of a city. It's just 30 feet above the street with taxis and everything else going. But I was wrong. And that convinced me that if we can attract nature to the middle of Manhattan with some thoughtful native plantings, we can do it anywhere. It's very encouraging. But there are 4 things we need to consider if we want to succeed. And the first one is we have to shrink the area that's in lawn. Because lawn is a deadscape. It's pretty, it's a status symbol, but it does not support life. It does not support ecosystem function. We've got over 40 million acres of lawn in this country. That is bigger than the area of New England. So I'm suggesting that we cut the area of lawn in half. The lawn we keep is still going to be manicured. We're still going to be good citizens, and it'll still be pretty, but there's going to be a lot more plants on our properties. And if we do that, and half the area that is now in lawn. That'll give us 20 million acres to work with. And if we do it at home, we can create a new national park that we call Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. And when we build this park at home, when we bring nature to our yards, it allows us to either develop for the first time or reacquaint ourselves with a personal relationship with nature. And we can do that whenever we have the time, at our own time or our own pace. It won't be forced. If we develop this personal relationship with nature, we will care about it and we will be better stewards of the planet. There's no way we're going to be good stewards of the planet if we don't even know what it is we're supposed to be stewarding. If we have this bit of nature at home, we can visit it without, we can avoid crowds, we can avoid travel hassles, all the things we have to face now if we go to a real national park. It's free, nobody's going to charge us, and it's never closed, no matter how many pandemics come down the road. If the government doesn't fund the government anymore, they can't close it. Plus, when we develop this relationship, we can do it alone. And this is particularly important for our kids, who right now, they know all about digital stuff, but they don't know anything about the natural world. And Richard Louv is worried about them suffering from nature deficit disorder. So what do? We get 30 kids, put them on a bus with a teacher, ship them off to some natural area. They walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything, and then they get back on the bus and go home. Well, I'm sure that's better than nothing. But what they've really had an experience with is 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. It's not that personal alone experience where they get to create that individual relationship with nature. No parents, just them alone. And you also might get to hunt lizards. And I've learned this from my granddaughter, Zoe, who sent me this picture. She lives in Hawaii, and her bit of nature is about 10 by 10 feet of lawn and a hedge. But there are knoll lizards there. And she said, this is how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground. You have to be serious. We're not kidding here. And you disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards do not see you coming. And you crawl very slowly. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizards, and you have a lot of fun doing it. I don't think she'll be hunting lizards like this the rest of her life, but I guarantee she will remember discovering how to hunt lizards all on her own for the rest of her life. If you want to do more than hunt lizards at home, get this book by Nancy Stranisti, Nature Play at Home, filled with great ideas of how to expose kids to the natural world. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. The plants we put in the area we take out of lawn, though, are going to be, at least some of them are going to be keystone plants. What do I mean by that? Well, we've discovered that it's not just native versus non-native. If you look across the spectrum of native plants, most of them aren't doing that much. A few of them are doing most of the work. About 5% of our native plants are making about 75% of that caterpillar food that drives our food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs, which means an awful lot of native plants are contributing something, but not all that much. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but I can construct an entirely non-native landscape or a native landscape that doesn't support very much if I choose the plants that are not those powerhouses that I'm calling keystone plants. So the question really is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our yards? Or benign plants, or even worse, do we want destructive plants? So if we get these Asian ornamentals that become invasive species, they don't stay in our yards. They go out and wreck our local ecosystems, like privet, like bush honeysuckle. You know what I'm talking about. I get an email once or twice a year from somebody saying, don't you know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? And then they continue to argue that makes them native, and that means that they can plant them and everything will be great. Well, this is not our metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. And you can argue about whether 7 million years ago is native. The metric is whether they're producing anything. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars. So they're there and they're taking up space, but they are not supporting your local food web. Here's what's supporting your local food web. Those oaks, the #1 keystone plant in 84% of the counties of North America. In the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars. 900 species of caterpillars nationwide. There's no other genus of plant that comes that close. Here's the power of keystone oaks in my yard. Now remember, I'm counting the moss species. I'm not done yet, by the way. This is not the final figure. But so far I've photographed 1,012 species of moss. Out of that 1,012, 888 have known host plants. We know what they're eating. So there's more than 100 we don't know what they're eating. But out of the 888 that we know about, 262 species use oaks. Now we have 59 genera of native woody plants on our property. Only one of those genera is Quercus, the oaks. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 2% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, yet they're supporting almost 30% of our moss species. So again, what if I took the oaks out of our property, that one genus of keystone plant? It would devastate the moth diversity and also the amount of bird food that's available, so we'd have a lot fewer birds. That's what keystone plants do. How do you know what the keystone plants are in your neighborhood? You go to Native Plant Finder in the National Wildlife Federation website, and you put in your zip code, and the ranked list of plant genera in your county, ranked in terms of their ability to support local caterpillars, will pop up again for your county. So here are the woody plants over here, and I stopped because I ran out of room. The list is much bigger than this. And here are the herbaceous plants. Now notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows, native maples. You can go to the nursery and buy non-native oaks. You can get English oak, you can get Chinese oak. It's very easy to get a non-native cherry, an Asian cherry. If you get a willow, it's almost certainly going to be weeping willow from the Middle East. Excuse me. But when you do that, even though these are native genera, the species, if they're from someplace else, do not support as many caterpillars. You're going to reduce the number of caterpillars that use these plants by 68% if you plant non-native members of those genera. How do I know that? We did a big common garden experiment and figured it out. These top 3 here, goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers, particularly the perennial sunflowers, not only support the most caterpillars, but they also support the most specialized bees. Remember the specialist bees? With these 3 genera, you get well over 30 species of bees that won't be there if you don't have those genera. Those are the only plants they can rear their young on. So people used to say, well, I don't know what to plant in order to increase wildlife in my yard. Now you do. You don't have that excuse anymore. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in those keystone plants. We're going to attract all these insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light. Of course, that's not the goal. But there's a lot of research, most of it from Europe at this point, showing us that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines worldwide. After 100 years of wondering why insects go to lights at night, particularly moths, we still don't have any idea, but they do. And they die from all of these reasons. Exhaustion is a big one. They fly around until they run out of energy. They collide with the light, they get incinerated, they die from dehydration. The bat comes and picks them off. It blinds a lot of these insects. Who knew? And messes up their daily activities. This is actually good news because it's so easy to turn around. All you have to do is turn your lights out. I know what you're going to say. I can't turn my lights out because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man comes. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out, particularly the mercury vapor lamp, that is the worst one, and put in a yellow bulb that has puts out yellow wavelengths, because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects than our white wavelengths. And the least attractive are yellow LED lights. If everybody switched to yellow LED lights overnight, we could save billions of insects around the country, and we'd save a whole lot of electricity. Fourth thing we need to do is landscape in a way that allows the caterpillars we attract to our yard to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, it spins a cocoon and hangs from the branches, then it emerges as an adult and does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that. But most species don't. 94%, 480 of those species drop from the tree and wiggle their way underground where they pupate, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter under the tree. And you know where I'm going here. We don't have any leaf litter under the tree, and the ground is mowed and compacted to the point where no caterpillar could get in there and be safe. So this becomes an ecological trap. We are luring adult insects in to lay their eggs here. The eggs hatch, the caterpillars develop, they drop to the ground and die. And the next generation is smaller until pretty soon they're all gone. I am sure that this is a major cause of insect declines that hasn't been examined at all. And of course, the cement landscape is even less viable option for caterpillars. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities. I'm trying to discourage the profligate use of cement as a default landscape. That's just laziness. That's lazy, and it ruins our watersheds. We know this. Most people do this. We have a big lawn, we stick a tree in it. Now nobody has measured what the success of caterpillars is in a situation like this. Can they get below the ground and complete their development? But I guarantee it's going to be higher success in a situation like this. We have a tree, then you have a layered landscape. Here's a native azalea, ferns, ground cover. You could have a dogwood over this. You got a three-dimensional landscape, and when the caterpillar drops down, it's a safe site here. The soil is very loose. They can easily get below the ground, or they can spin up in the leaf litter. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to squish them by stepping on them. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you reduce the area in lawn. Build a bed around each of your trees, and all this area that used to be lawn is now a beautiful planting and a safe site for the caterpillars. This is where you can put your wild ginger, ground cover, your May apples, your foam flower, anything, again, that's not going to be mowed or stepped on. There's room for compromise in our plant choice, and that's good news. And that comes from the research from another PhD student, Desiree Narango, who looked at population dynamics of chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. So she was working with typical suburban yards inside the Beltway in Washington. And what she did was compare how well chickadees reproduced in landscapes where the plants were mostly native versus landscapes where they were mostly introduced ornamentals. Easy to find these landscapes, tough to find these, but she found enough. Had nest boxes up in each one of them. And the first thing she found is that the landscapes dominated by non-native ornamentals produced 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, the chickadees had 75% less bird food to work with. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. The pair would come and check out the box, but they looked at the landscape and said, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. The clutches, the nests themselves were 29% less likely to make it to fledging. If they did make it to fledging, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do it. And you might say, well, those aren't huge differences. But if you put all that together into a population growth model, this is what you get as a function of the percentage of non-native plant biomass in your landscape, from no non-native plants to 100%. This dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you make babies at the same rate that the adults are dying, you've got a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population, but if you make fewer, you've got a shrinking population. Right here is where they overlap. What that means is that if you have more than 30%, it's about 30% non-native plant biomass in your yard, it pushes you down into this area, which is an unsustainable shrinking population. So it's all a function of the percentage of non-native plants. So I'm excited about this study for two reasons. First of all, this is the first time this has been measured for any bird anywhere. So if you doubt that your plant choice is influencing other things that want to live in your property, look at this study. But this area here is exciting to me because that is the area of compromise. If my message was you can't have any non-native plants, very few people would be listening to me. But you can have your camellia, you can have your boxwood, you can't have any invasive plants, but you can even have your ginkgo, your crepe myrtle, as long as it doesn't dominate the plant biomass in your yard. Can native plants be used in formal designs? Somebody sent me this picture in the spring, and I was sloppy about tracking the email. I have no idea who it was, but it's the land manager of this formal garden. And what he's doing is sneaking in native plants without telling anybody. So far he's got Joe Pye in here. Notice I'm not calling it Joe Pye weed. And his goal is to replace everything in here with native plants, just to show you can have a formal design that has native plants in it. Remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay over there because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a traditional suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It's beautiful. It's providing several species of pollen for our specialist bees. And if everybody did it, we'd have a lot more native bees out there. This is a design, so was the former one by Drew Latham, which shows you don't even have to have a fence around it. It's a beautiful planting. Imagine the amount of life that is here versus the amount of life that is here. So all of this is very possible. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing plan to encourage homeowners to replace all or part of their lawn with appropriate prairie plantings. The state helps them do that. What a great program. There are parts of Florida, southern Florida, that are paying people to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in their front yards. If you have a burrowing owl, you get paid for it. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written. It should have been written with carrots, not with sticks. If people got paid to have an endangered species on their property, everybody would want one. There'd be no controversy at all. Missouri had a bounty on calorie pears. If you brought in a body of a calorie pear, you got a free tree replacement. This is a utility in San Antonio. San Antonio Water System is giving $100 coupons for people to plant water-savvy plants in their dry environment. Of course, they're always native species. And there's a lot of lawn replacement programs in California and Arizona where you get up to $2 per square foot of lawn that you remove and put in appropriate xeric plantings. I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first is that we've assumed nature is important, but it's not essential. And what that means is, as soon as push comes to shove, and it always does when money's involved, nature gets the back seat. It's low priority. We're coming up on an election, as you know, and pretty soon somebody's going to publish the top 10 things that people are worried about. And the loss of biodiversity is not going to be on that list. Or if it is, it'll be the very first time. But I doubt it. I doubt it. We just don't think it's essential. But, we like it. We don't want to lose it, but we don't care about it in the very deep sense. I was in Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-size poster, which I think reflects very well our society's attitude towards conservation. And this includes a lot of top names in conservation. We want to save wildlife, we want to save species so that our future generations, our kids, can enjoy them. And that is true. But that tells me that we think nature's there just for entertainment. It's far more than that. We need to save the natural world so that we have future generations. We're not going to live without them, believe me. Second, we have assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And, we talked about this, but this guarantees that any conservation efforts are going to fail. The 150 nation effort to preserve biodiversity. They had a 10-year program, and they had 10 goals or 20 goals. Anyway, in 2020, they just assessed them. They didn't meet any of their goals because we're only trying to do conservation where there aren't any people. And that's not good enough. That's not going to conserve very much, because those areas, again, are too small and too isolated from each other to permanently preserve the natural systems that we need. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and ecosystems. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. It's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems. And we put no man's land here in between each one of those ecosystem fragments. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that terminology because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the Earth has ecological significance, including our yards, including all of our human-dominated landscapes. So what we need to do is put the plants back in between those habitat fragments. We need to glue our ecosystems back together again, so we have a functional Persian rug. And the plants we're going to put back, at least some of them, are going to be those keystone plants that do most of the work. Not only are we going to connect these fragments with biological corridors so plants and animals can move back and forth, we're going to make it so rich in between those fragments that they can actually live there, which means we're going to share our spaces. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. And I have no idea why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't all of us, everybody, bear the responsibility for good Earth stewardship? I have no idea. Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset, and not just the settlers, the Western mindset is, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. We're not born with these mindsets, we're taught them. So we can have rights, but we also have obligations. We can't forget this part. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And this approach empowers each one of us. I'm excited about that because, right now, our problems are so huge, we all feel powerless. There's nothing one person can do, we'll just go out and shoot each other. Not true. You can go out, you can plant that oak tree, you can plant a black cherry, one of those powerhouse plants, and the very next day go out and see what's using it. You can watch conservation happen in a very short period of time. Put in those pollinator plants, the native bees will come. It makes one person a very important cog in this giant wheel of conservation. One person can make a difference. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire world's problems. Just think about your little part of the world that you can manipulate. If you own a piece of property, that's easy. If you don't, volunteer at a park or a preserve. And there's 4 things we need to do. We need to shrink the lawn. We need to put in a pollinator garden. We need to remove invasive species. I didn't talk a lot about that, but that's obvious. And we need to plant those keystone species. Everybody does it, and you don't have to do it in one day. Just pick at it. Just on private property, we'd be 85% done if we all treated the land we own that way. So as property owners, or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we actually decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and ultimately our own fate. So I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope, and I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks for listening. We can do questions now.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. Whenever I hear you talk or read your book, I'm struck by the fact that gardeners have a superpower they just don't realize. I mean, if we don't, there's people cleaning the ocean and cleaning the atmosphere and doing amazing things out there, but if we can get band gardeners together, gardeners can save the world. So, so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right. So we've had a very active Q&A chat session. So I'm going to start throwing some questions out to you, and you can answer them. Any advice that you can give regarding the mosquito sprayers? Any regulation, any good argument? I mean, I think we all know what the argument is to our neighbors, but how do we approach our neighbors or our town council about more regulation on those companies?
Well, we can start by getting the facts straight. So the news from Mosquito Joe is that what he's spraying is a natural product, therefore it's okay. And it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids from plants like chrysanthemums, but cyanide is a natural product too. It doesn't make it okay. He'll also say it only kills mosquitoes. That is just plain not true. It kills all the insects that it comes in contact with. And if your neighbor's spraying his yard, the fog goes over to your yard. Does he have the right to kill all the things you're trying to create? That's a legal question, and I'm sure he doesn't think he's doing that, and he probably thinks he's doing you a favor. The big thing is to convince the people who are paying for this that it doesn't work. That's why I have to come back and back and back. In order to control mosquitoes by spraying adults, you have to kill 90% of them. Mosquito spraying on fogging on average kills 10% of them, which means it's never going to actually control the mosquitoes. You control mosquitoes in the larval stage. So try to convince people that it's good larval control methods that will work. In a typical suburban situation, you can use something like mosquito dunks. We have to be a little bit careful here, but get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in hay or straw, and let it ferment for a couple of days. And that becomes irresistible to mosquitoes that are full of eggs, ovipositing mosquitoes. They will lay their eggs in that bucket. So right away, you've got an aquatic situation that only has mosquitoes in it. Then you buy something at the hardware store called mosquito dunks. It's a bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, and it kills aquatic diptera. So you put it in your bucket, the larvae hatch, and they chew on it, and then they die. And if everybody did that, you'd be killing a whole lot of mosquitoes very effectively in your neighborhood. Now you also have to get rid of the features of your neighborhood that are creating mosquitoes. And often it is your sewers along your streets that don't drain completely. Often there's 1 or 2 inches of water down there. Perfect breeding place for a lot of mosquitoes. So you can throw some dunks down in there. What you don't want to do is put mosquito dunks in your little pond or a natural swampy area. Permanent bodies of water don't make mosquitoes. I mean, they do, but they're full of predators that eat those mosquitoes. They are not the big source of mosquito populations. It's temporary bodies of water that don't have those predators that create it. So you want to target those temporary bodies of water. The reason you don't want to put mosquito bunks in your dunks in permanent bodies of natural systems is that it kills other diptera, things like chironomids, the midges. They don't bite, they don't hurt anybody, but they're important components of aquatic systems, and we don't want to be wiping them out. So used properly, mosquito dunks would be a great way for each homeowner to control their own mosquitoes. It's cheap, and your township could save a whole lot of money by doing that instead of Mosquito Joe.
All right, thank you for that. Next question. When you talked about all the moths that you have and all the eating that they're doing of your foliage in your yard, can you attract too many moths that will defoliate your landscaping?
Well, you don't just attract the moths, you attract the birds that eat them too. A lot of people say, oh, you show pretty pictures of caterpillars. When I go out, I can't find any. And that, I don't see all those in one day. You run across them now and then, and that's because the birds have eaten most of them. So there are caterpillars that can cause you problems, and they're typically, well, first of all, introduced caterpillars do. So when I say we need insects, I'm not talking about non-native insects like gypsy moth or any other, hemlock woolly adelgid or emerald ash borer. Any other non-native insect is here without its natural enemies. So they always cause problems. But we do have some native insects, native caterpillars like tent caterpillar or fall webworm that make these tents. They're protected within them, so a lot of birds can't get them. Plus, they're hairy. Birds don't like hairy caterpillars very much. If they're very hungry, they'll take them and whip them around and try to knock those hairs off. But being hairy is a good defense, and those are also eruptive species, meaning they have, they peak one year, then they'll crash for 2 or 3 years, and then they'll peak another year. So the tent caterpillar can defoliate your cherry or your apple, and people get all upset. The trees always come back. It's really not a big deal for the tree. But the reason they're doing that is because they have figured out a way to avoid that bird predation. Typically, though, you're not going to have any kind of serious problem from native caterpillars when you have a balanced ecosystem. So you've got those birds, you've got a lot of insect parasitoids that really hammer those caterpillars later in the season. I met a woman in, we worry about our leaves being eaten because it's unsightly. We still think our plants are just decorations, and you want your decoration to be perfect. Well, I understand that, but I met a woman in New Orleans, Tammany Baumgarten, who suggested that we all practice the 10-step program. You take 10 steps back from your trees and all of your insect problems disappear because you can't see those little things that are eaten. I think that's great advice, and you can save yourself a whole lot of worry.
Okay. Can you recommend plants that will attract and feed a lot of caterpillars but will thrive in the shade?
Yeah, plants like the sun, and caterpillars like plants that like the sun because leaves that are in the sun have more nitrogen in it. So if you have a plant and half of it's shaded and half of it's not, caterpillars will be on the sunny leaves because they have more nitrogen in them. So which ones are great making caterpillars in the shade? People are always asking about which plants will bloom in the shade that would be good for pollinators. And one of those would be native hydrangea arborescens, not the cultivar Annabelle, because that's got sterile flowers, but the straight species. It does really well blooming in the shade, and it's really good for pollinators. It also has a few caterpillars on it, but hydrangea is not a great one for caterpillars. You got me stumped on this one. It's really going to be your plants in the sun that support most of the caterpillars.
Okay. All right. Well, that makes sense. What about the use of milky spore to get rid of Japanese beetles and their grubs? How does that affect other species or native species?
Oh, not much. It's another disease that is specific to beetle larvae in the family Scarabaeidae. So it hits Japanese beetles, but we have 3 or 4 species of Asian scarabs now. The Asian, what's it called? The Asian beetle, I don't know what, but you'll notice there are a lot of beetles coming out of your lawn these days. It's not just the Japanese beetle. I think milky spore gets all of them. So it does work. The big problem with milky spore is that it's very slow. You seed your lawn with it, and then the next year the larva has to crawl through and actually eat a spore. It'll kill that one larva, and then the larva stays right there, and the spores are all right there. And the dispersion of the milky spore is very, very slow throughout your yard. So I've never heard anybody saying, "Oh wow, this really works great." It does work, but it's slow, and typically you're putting it on, but your neighbor's not. So you'll still see just as many Japanese beetles because they're coming from other places where there's a lot of lawn. Japanese beetles, adults, eat a lot of plants. So they're generalists as adults, but as larvae, they're specialists on grass. And if we've got 40 million acres of grass, we're making a lot of Japanese beetle larvae. And your little bit of milky spore probably isn't going to do it, unfortunately.
Okay, all right. A question about the light pollution, and we're coming into the biggest lighted season of the year with the holidays coming up. I had a question about the projected holiday lights that that instead of stringing lights, they project onto your house or onto the bushes. What kind of effect does that have, if any?
Well, we typically do that around Christmas, and of course, where I live, it's cold. The moths are not flying at Christmas time. So that's one benefit there, that most of our decorative lighting happens when it's cold, and the night flying insects populations are really, really small. You probably have a few more down there in North Carolina, but that's probably not our biggest worry. The big worry are these mercury vapor security lights that run all summer long. That are really attractive to insects. Those would be the ones that I'd want to target.
Okay. All right. A question about leaf litter, and of course you talked about that a little bit, how important it is. If you're running over the leaf litter a couple of times with a mower, is that very destructive?
Well, if you got your sweet gum tree and a beautiful Luna moth, eats your sweet gum tree and then spins a cocoon in a leaf, which then falls to the ground, then you run over it with your mower, you don't have a Luna moth anymore. So yeah, it is destructive. It kills pretty much anything that's in that leaf litter. It also shortens the life of those leaves as leaf litter. Remember, leaf litter is the perfect mulch. You want to keep the ground covered all season long. If you have a leaf litter mulch in your beds and it's gone by July, it means you didn't have enough leaf litter, or you didn't have the right leaf litter. Oak leaves, it's another good thing about oaks, they can last up to 3 years. But maples and tulips and tulip poplars, they often don't make it through the season. So if you grind them up, they disintegrate even faster. People do that. I guess it's an aesthetic thing. Again, they it's all even and ground up, but you're losing a lot of benefits from your leaf litter when you do that.
Okay. All right. And speaking of cleaning up around the garden, if we wanted to cut back the old stalks, do some deadheading on flowering perennials, when is the least destructive time to do that?
Late February. Every time you deadhead something, you're removing it as a seed source. So, there are a lot of, you're feeding the birds, but a lot of birds, like many of your sparrows and juncos and will come down and don't go to your feeder. They want to get the seeds in their natural state. Goldfinches do go to your feeder, but they also, they'll pick apart your black-eyed Susans and your evening primrose. They're very good at getting the seeds from the plants that you had during the summertime. If you deadhead them all, you've just thrown all of that out. So the best time to do it is at the end of the winter, after the birds have eaten all of that.
Okay. All right. And riddle me this, Batman. Parsley is not a native plant to North Carolina, but the swallowtail caterpillar butterfly is. So why do they love it so much?
Well, because they're a specialist on that family of plants, the umbelliferae. And parsley is an agricultural crop that we have bred most of the nasties out of so that we eat it. So it has the chemical signature that says this is the right family for me to eat this plant. But it also is easier for them to digest than the native umbellifers, which are pretty, they're pretty rough plants. They're pretty toxic. So the black swallowtail says, well, I'll eat the one that's easier to eat, just like we do. They're ag plants. So that it can be confusing. So here's a native insect eating a non-native plant that is in the same family. I don't even think, it might even be the same genus as its native plants. And you might say, well, didn't you just tell us they don't do that? 68% reduction, it's true, but that means there's what, 32% that do eat them. And the black swallowtail is one of those. So it's one of those exceptions.
Okay. All right, great, thank you. What's the safest method to getting rid of invasives?
Safest. Safest. If you want to get rid of them, you got to kill the roots. So the safest method is also one of the hardest and least likely to work. And that would be to cut back. Well, you cut back the plant. I mean, by safest, I mean, you're probably saying, I don't want to use any herbicide. And that's what a lot of people are saying these days. And I understand that. And that's the way Cindy and I approached our property in the beginning. But right away you find out if you don't kill the root system, it comes right back. But if you can exhaust the root system eventually, if you keep cutting off any new growth, and by keep doing it, I mean every 2 weeks, and it probably take you a couple of years. So if you have any size property at all, you get tired of that real fast. What we do is compromise. We don't spray because you always hit non-target things when you spray. So what we do is we cut the plant off at the base. And by we, I mean me, because Cindy won't touch the stuff. And then I get a paintbrush and I paint the herbicide on the stump. So it's very little material. One of these days, I want to take a soil sample right next to where I painted and see what is actually in there, so that I can have some figures for you. But the object is to kill the root so it doesn't come back. I'm not going to live long enough to fight all these things that are constantly coming into our yard if I don't kill them each time. So I consider it like chemotherapy. It's undesirable. We don't want to do it, but if you don't do it, you lose. So that's my take on it.
All right, thank you. What about native vines that are particularly aggressive? Can they become invasive as well, like a non-native?
You use the right word there. They can be aggressive. The definition of an invasive species is non-native. So a native can never be an invasive. It can, they're aggressive and they duke it out with other natives the way they always have. But that's a natural interaction that's always been happening. By native vines, you're probably talking about things like Virginia creeper or native clematis can be pretty aggressive. But native grapes are one of the most aggressive, and they form these huge vines and they crawl up our trees. In the old days, the only place they thrived was in a light gap in the forest where big trees had fallen down. We've turned that on its head, so now everything is a light gap. So those vines do really well. Things like grape, it's a really productive plant. So I never paint a grapevine, but sometimes they, they, like you said, they're aggressive and they will start to cover my tree. So I cut them off at the base and just set them back. And then it takes them a couple of years to get to be a problem again. What our native vines don't do, and I've always found this very interesting, is they don't strangle the trees the way things like Oriental bittersweet do, that wrap around and girdle the tree, and so that it breaks off when you get an ice storm or something. And I don't know why. Or poison ivy is another one. It'll climb up the tree, but it doesn't girdle it. So they don't kill the trees the way those non-native vines do. Not sure why. But yeah, you probably have to manage those the way you would manage anything else.
Okay. And are there any advice that you can offer for a gardener on a budget trying to restore their garden into native plants?
Start from seed. Takes longer. You won't get the instant gratification, but you can enjoy the process. So I wasn't kidding when I said most of the oaks that we planted on our yard, I planted as an acorn, totally free. And now I'm actually editing because I planted so many. I'm losing my light. Many of those are 40, 50 feet tall. Believe it or not, it's been 20 years, wow. But oaks do grow. They really do. And but it was all free. So the other thing is be patient. If you want to plant everything at once, it's hard to do that without spending some money, but coddle the ones you plant, nurture them. If you do plant from seed, you've got to protect them. I don't know if you have a deer problem. Almost everybody does, but deer love to get those little tender native plants. So you have to protect them in some way that way. But that's
And that was going to be my next question. Someone's asking, do you have deer resistant plants that you could recommend?
Deer resistant plants are plants that nothing else wants to eat too. So the deer love the most productive plants just the way our caterpillars do. So I wouldn't recommend planting a 100% deer resistant landscape because first of all, a starving deer will eat anything. But you'll also create a landscape that supports very, very little. So things like ferns, support very little. Deer don't like them. Spice bush is a good one to have, and it supports a few things like the spice bush caterpillar and a few other things, but it's very low on the rank list of plants. But the deer generally don't touch it, and that's why you go into the woods, and that's typically the only native shrub you find is spice bush, because the deer don't typically like it. I think it's better to look for plants that well, it's better to I put cages around the plants I want to keep, and then particularly young trees, they grow up and get past the point where deer can hurt them, and then I take the cage off. I call that graduation. You know, we've got 10 acres. We're not going to fence the whole 10 acres. That's too big a deal. So I just move these cages around. But you know, deer is just a terrible issue that makes it really hard, and I sympathize.
Yeah. And another man-created problem, but we won't go there.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, you know, goldenrod is one of your very best herbaceous plants, and deer pretty light on that too. So there's another one you should go for.
Okay. All right. And we've had a couple of shout outs about Daniel wanted me to mention plant swaps for another budget conscious way. I don't know how plant swaps are being affected by COVID. I know that Hawk in the past, we have hosted plant swaps and participated in them as well. So again, stay tuned to our website. Also wanted to give a shout out to a local nursery, Pike's Nursery, both in Matthews and the one on Johnston Road in South Charlotte. I have a friend there who has worked for a couple of years now in talking them into carrying native plants, and they have a really good selection of native plants at both locations. So, and especially this time of year, you know, it's great for trees and shrubs to be planted in the fall. And they've got a really good selection of both. So, if anybody else, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I should have brought up. Look at plant knot swaps too. I've got a friend who's got a small yard. It's loaded with native plants, but he's constantly has to thin and give things away. He's not looking for any more, so there's no swapping involved. He just wants to give seeds or you know, plants away. And every year I go and dig up stuff from his yard. It's a great way to get things.
Okay, great. That's a great one. And Daniel wanted me to point out also Ross Farms is another local nursery that carries a lot of native plants. I had a question about the Monarch Delight plant and the we'll call them Monarch Delight beetles that get on them. And there's a lot of times they can do a lot of damage to a Monarch Delight plant. So do you have any recommendations, or you just want to say accept those beetles?
Yeah, there are two species of milkweed beetles, and there's milkweed bugs, the Onchopeltis bugs right now, large milkweed bug that a lot of people think they're beetles, but they're not. They're black and orange that are feeding on the outer layer of milkweed seeds. People see these things on there and they get excited, say, oh, they're going to hurt my milkweed. They're part of the natural milkweed fauna. That ought to be there. There's another one, the milkweed caterpillar, that's fuzzy black and orange, and they're always gregarious. So when they get on a single milkweed stalk, they almost always strip it. And people say, oh, you just killed my milkweed. They didn't kill your milkweed. It always comes up from the roots. That's part of what ought to be on milkweed. Just enjoy it and don't worry about it. You know what? If those things are wiping out the living stalks you have, you don't have enough milkweed. Get a bigger patch, and then everybody can have enough and be happy.
All right. Great advice. And I've got a lot of people sharing their nursery suggestions in the Q&A session. If you'll go to the chat feature on Zoom at the bottom of your screen, go to chat, write the answer or write your nursery that you would recommend there. And this presentation, including the chat recording, will all be available on our website later this week. So you'll be able to go back and read what everybody said, as well as hear this wonderful presentation again. I've got a question that it says, how can the same families evolve on opposite sides of the planet?
They didn't. When they evolved, they were on the same side of the planet. Remember, our continents moved. We used to have a supercontinent. There's Pangea, and Gondwanaland and all these different names, but the continents all used to be together in one giant landmass, and then they split up. So South America and Africa split up. That's why it looks like they fit together, because they did split together. And when these plant families evolved, which was a long time ago, those continents were actually together. Good question, though. Did I lose you?
No, I'm here. I'm sorry. I forgot to mute myself. It says, I've read some of your advice on meadows planted with native grasses and forbs. I do not want to revert to a forest. I have forested and successional land. When do you advise to mow? I also use selective herbiciding of invasives. So living in Piedmont of North Carolina, what do you recommend about maintaining 19 acres of grassland ecosystem?
Okay, that's great. That's very valuable, because that's one of the rarest ecosystems we have these days. So it's great that you're willing to take that effort. The recommendation is that no matter what size meadow you have, you mow or burn a third of it each year. And you would do that at the time that's least destructive, which probably is early spring. So that 2/3 of your meadow is left intact and can serve as a source of colonization. All the things still living there, all the native bees and those guys that weren't killed by your fire or your mowing, can then recolonize the part that you did mow. You don't want to treat it all, mow or burn all 19 acres at once, because then all the things that live there are really taking a big hit. They've got to recolonize it from someplace else then. So you can, especially if you're treating the invasive woodies separately, a little spot treating, you only have to actually mow it once every 3 years, or mow any one section once every 3 years.
All right, great advice. Here's a bird-related question. Does the yellow-billed cuckoo eat tent caterpillars?
Yes, it's a tent caterpillar. It's a fuzzy caterpillar specialist. And so is the black-billed cuckoo. Hard to see, but you can hear them easily. You can tell whether they're around. And I'm glad you asked that question, so I can give you this statistic. This year, well, I went around our property and I looked at our tents. And when the cuckoos find a tent, they slice it open and then eat every caterpillar that's inside. I had 22 tents on my 10 acres, and all 22 were nailed by the cuckoos. So there's, now the tents were established, and they wait until the caterpillars get sizable so that there's something to eat. But they completely controlled my tent caterpillars. I wish they did that all the time, but there's not enough cuckoos to go around, and people get all upset about the tents. But yep, they can do that because they can shed the lining of their esophagus and their stomach lining. That's why most birds won't eat hairy caterpillars, because it lines their stomach, and that's not good. But the cuckoos have the ability to throw up the lining of their esophagus and their stomach and get rid of the hairs periodically, and that's why they specialize on them. They will actually follow gypsy moth infestations because there's so much to eat.
Wow, very cool. And what was the top 4 things that you recommend people do again?
Oh, okay. Shrink the lawn. That's number 1. Look at what you already have growing in your property. And if any of those are invasive, you want to get rid of those. So that would be something like Callery pear, a top one, privet, burning bush, the barberry, the ones that are escaping that you see in the wild all the time, miscanthus, there's a bunch of them. So you're going to shrink the lawn, you're going to get rid of your invasive species. You want to replace them with those real top producers, those keystone plants, and put in some kind of pollinator garden if you can. Now, everybody doesn't have a property big enough to do everything. If you have one big oak in your property and it's shading everything, let the neighbor down the street deal with the sunny spots and the pollinator gardens. Certainly don't cut down the oak so that you can have sun for your pollinator. But those are the 4 things that I suggest.
Useful.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question about plant recommendation, wondering if there's a smallish oak that would be useful to someone who doesn't want to lose a lot of sunshine in their yard.
There's a couple of them. Blackjack oak is small. Dwarf chinkapin oak is small. Dwarf chestnut oak is small. These species make acorns when they're 7-8 feet tall. So those are all possibilities. And down south, we've got 90 species of oaks in this country. Most of them are not in the trade, but they could easily be. And there are some other small ones that I'd have to look up in a book, but not all oaks are giants.
Okay, great. I think we are coming to the end of it. That's pretty much everybody's questions. If I didn't get to you, I'm sorry. We've had some questions asking you to repeat some things, but since this is going to be available, the recording and the chat feature, so everybody will be able to go back and look at it. I want to again, let me see if I can share my screen here. I want to pick. Let me see, I want to go to the end. I just want to highlight this native plant finder on the National Wildlife Federation website. That is a fabulous resource. All you've got to do is go to that plant finder, put in your zip code, and it's going to give you a nice, a great list of native plants that you can grow in your backyard, on your balcony, on your plantation, your farm, however big or small you've got, you'll be able to find it on that list. So, and that was Dr. Tallamy's brainchild there. That's of his work. So, Dr. Tallamy, again, I can't tell you how exciting it is to hear you speak. I wish it was in person, but after COVID and after your next book, we're going to get you back down to Charlotte. So,
okay, looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody. And go to our website in HAWKNCWF.org, and later this week, and the recording will be available to you. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Okay. Good night, Carol.
Good night. Tell Cindy I said hi.
I will.
Okay.